Well, I'm sitting here in the minister's office of the Unitarian Church in Cambridge with the incredible Andrew Brown, Andy Brown, who is I've known since 1986, 87.
Yeah, it's got to be around that sort of
So,
time.
when you dropped into my bookshop, we still like books, as you can see by the background. um, and what brought you to my bookshop?
Yes, what brought me to the bookshop? Well, I'd got to my A levels and I was studying history and English, both subjects I'm still very passionate about. A place called Tendring High School out on the Essex coast. And during that time, I discovered music. And I'd become passionate not only about the Beatles, but had very quickly got into jazz, and Miles Davis had become huge for me, especially Bitches Brew, that wonderful 1970 album. So I was just obsessed with being a musician, and my grandmother had bought me a second-hand double bass, and my parents had bought me a electric bass, and I was busily learning and also busily not studying for my A-levels. So I managed to get very poor grades. Became a pretty good musician, which was good.
Well, that was training to be poor. Poor grades.
That's right.
The poverty of a musician.
So I was training to be poor, so I was into music in a big way. And along that journey, I'd also discovered various people, especially the beat poets. I'd fallen in love with American beat poetry, the late 40s into the 50s. So that's in the background. And then I finished my A-levels, and not surprisingly, my parents say that I really have to get a job. I can't just loaf around at home, which felt hard, but it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So after a number of false starts, I was forced to get myself sorted out and look for a job. And I happened to open up a local newspaper and saw an advert for a YTS young training youth training scheme. That's right, offering a job at the poetry bookshop at the Colchester Arts Centre. And I thought, I could do that. I'd like to do that. So I duly did all the appropriate things, wrote, and John asked me for an interview, so I turned up.
Well, actually, I think
day.
it was probably Anita who was the manager.
That's right, Anita. Yeah.
Actually, it was a wonderful American woman from Baltimore who was manager of the bookshop, not the bookshop, the Arts Centre, and which was great because she was into jazz and blues as well. So
that's right.
My memory is that you came for an interview with her, and then you got to see her, and she sent you through to me, saying you might be able to use this chap. Not the chap of Baltimore wouldn't have used chap, but
no, that's true.
So
that could
it was a weird. I didn't even know I was interviewing you, most likely, but I think you mentioned beat poets.
Yeah, well, there's that story that we've rehearsed a few times over the years, which was my interview. I mean, I was taking this as an interview. I mean, John says he didn't think he was interviewing me. Maybe that's why it went this way. But I'd mentioned that I like the beat poets. In fact, it's probably behind me here. Well, it will be behind me, which is Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which I knew, a very famous poem from that period. But John didn't know whether I knew it or whatnot. So he leant over and he pulled out Howl by Allen Ginsberg, opened it up and read it to me, just all of it out loud, piece of performance poetry. And he said, "What do you think?" To which I replied, "Well, that's fucking amazing." That's exactly what I said. I was the enthusiasm of youth, and you said to me, "You've got the job," or at least that's how I remember it.
Yeah, well, that's vaguely. I remember reading it, and I remember you being with me for some time after that. I mean, my desk used to be incredibly untidy, as my desks still are, and I remember coming in one day and it was all in neat piles, and there was a little note on top saying, "Don't worry, I haven't thrown anything away." But also during that period, I discovered you were a bass player.
Yes.
Well, quite early, and so I was experimenting with. I had been experimenting for years with poetry and music. I'd been with Nick Toksek, who in Stereo Graffiti, which was a sort of poetry and music cabaret, sort of, or review, I think is what they call it, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you do a few songs and a few poems and all that stuff. And then I tried with various other people. Well, before that, I'd done some experimental jazz stuff with in London in the late '60s, with a few avant-garde jazz musicians, and which happened to be one of you quite liked your free form.
I did, yeah.
And so we I don't know whether we did it solo, just as a duo first, occasionally when I got a book in, or whether we went in head first and created this. At the time, I was sort of, in a previous existence, I'd looked after and managed reggae and funk bands. So I had this sort of pool of musicians, of reggae and funk musicians on one hand, and you had this pool of jazz musicians. And we brought them together in the most unlikely. It would have worked very well in New York at that time.
It would have worked very well.
I've listened to what was going on in New York at that time, and it's precisely what we were doing.
That's right.
However, in Essex and Suffolk and Norfolk, it probably...
we were it.
So, I mean, there was great on stage battles, musical battles, and I put two bass players together, which worked. That was the most successful bit, when they're both Gordon Mulrain, who'd been the bass player with John Warrior, and was Desmond Decker's and Prince Buster's bass player when they were over touring, and you two managed to you had some quite good musical conversations on stage, and we just
well, again, that was one of the nice accidental, fortuitous, use whatever word you want, of being passionate about Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, because that record, which drew me into the music in the first place, one of its notable features, if you're a bass player, is it has an electric bass player and a double bass player on many of the tracks. So it was something that appealed to me, and it was great fun. And always worth mentioning that we were lucky to have that wild man of British free jazz with us, Mick Brannan, who would often play quite a lot, who was around at the Arts Centre a lot during that period.
Yeah, he was extraordinary. I mean, he's he's had quite a good recording career as well, hasn't he? He appears on.
Yeah, he appears. He ducks and dives through the history of British free jazz and even some of the more avant-garde pop things. Yeah, the Cleaners from Venus, some of you may remember. But yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, and I remember that. Terry, who took over from Rock as drummer, and didn't quite get it as well. I mean, Rock always got it.
Yeah.
There was this wonderful moment where, and I should be talking to Rock later in this weekend, but where it was always late. Well, no, he always got there by the skin of his teeth, and we'd set up his drum kit for him. It was at the Arts Centre, and I was at this point where I was going to say, and now you, the audience, are going to have to be, and I was going to say, the percussion. And at that moment, he walked in, picked up his sticks and played. So, which was actually totally in keeping with what we were.
It's also worth, I think, adding here that the name of the band, you named it John Rowe's Sound Proposition, which of course was wonderfully true at almost every level, except at the level of it being a sound proposition for any of us in terms of monetary well-being. But in every other respect, it was fantastic. John Rowe's sound proposition was it was a great start to my career. Really, that's how it began, and also because I was hanging out with you at the Arts Centre, that's also the reason I managed to start playing with some fairly well-known jazz musicians sitting in, and it's through you that I got the chance to play with Tal Faldo one evening, the great bebop guitar player. So thank you, John.
Yeah, well, we had some great. That was a great gigs going on.
Yeah,
there. It was. I remember, because I was blues enthusiast. They had and as was Anita, and she had made friends with John Stedman from SB whatever it is Records.
Yes.
And excuse me, 12 months a year hay fever, and. Whenever he had a bluesman touring Europe, which is where they made their money, no one makes money in this country.
Nope.
But they would come here to record. So he'd phone up Anita and say, "Did you want?" And we had, Jimmy Witherspoon, Phil Guy, who was Buddy Guy's brother, who marvellously, when Tim Moore, the drummer, we'd pick up. They were all all those guys. We'd pick up session musicians for them, and there was the sax player was from California, lived in Ipswich, and so Phil and the sax player spent the whole break and beforehand talking about California, and so Tim's about to go on stage. They're all about to go on stage, and Tim says, "What am I doing?" And Phil said, "Follow my foot," which I thought was great. So, but that was that much more about a band that knew about music that much more than that I did. The strength and weakness of Sound Proposition was the band leader knew nothing about music.
That's true. Yeah, your greatest weakness was also your greatest strength, and vice versa. Yeah. It worked. It just somehow, I don't know how, it just worked.
So, during that period, you also took an interest in religion.
Oh, religion. Yeah, religion. Yeah, well, I've always been interested in very liberal, free, inquiring, creative forms of religion. Grew up in a pretty standard but liberal Anglican setting, but just being interested in jazz and was hanging out with folk like you and other musicians, I quickly got an interest in world religions in general, meeting lots of people with different religious traditions, philosophies. So yeah, I became interested in religion and philosophy very early on, which is really handy if you're having that kind of interest as a musician, because a lot of people imagine that professional musicians play music. Well, that's true at one level, of course, but at another level it's not true, because a lot of the time if you're out touring and doing things, you're not playing, you're sitting on a bus, or you're sitting on a plane, or you're sitting in a train station or a van or a hotel room, and you've got a lot of time to kill. And you can kill that time in various ways.
which we have done at different times.
That's right. But fortunately, I think for me, a lot of my time was spent. Oh, well, this is the time to read this book and this book and this book. So yeah, they ran in parallel.
So did you decided to go off and study theology, didn't you? Did you study it at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I remember when you told me, I said, "Well, you better go and see my mate Cliff."
Well, that's true. So yeah, we can come to that story, but we can, and I will. But actually, I think we can do it.
So we can go around in a circle to get there.
We can, because part of that story happens at the tail end of, perhaps I suppose, the most obviously big gig we ever did at Sound Proposition, which was the tour of East Germany. And the reason it'll come back to religion is, at that time I was beginning to think about, well, maybe I'll make some kind of change of career. And And I was beginning to explore very seriously going into the Anglican ministry, Anglican priesthood. I didn't do it. I became a Unitarian minister. But at the time, that's what I was exploring. And I had on me all the forms to fill in to do that when we went on tour to East Germany. And then I had to leave to go to France. But I don't know if you want to tease out the East German story.
Oh, well, this was, yeah, we'd, amongst the people who'd been, well, it was after the wall came down.
Yeah.
And we've got to give credit here to Attila, the stockbroker, that had done a lot of work in East Germany and Eastern Europe before the wall came down, before the changes. And he had, and so when the changes happened, there was, I think, musicians got in touch with him, or George, who was an agent or sort of mover and groover in Halle.
In Halle, that's right.
In East Germany, wanted to put a tour together for his partner, Ilona Wildebrand. I think it was Ilona, wasn't it?
It rings a bell. Yeah, I remember George very well.
Yeah. So and then there was, but there was all sorts of musicians came over, really, because the thing about East Germany, and people don't realise this in the old Eastern Bloc. And I used to be, when people said how appalling stuff was there, I used to say, well, I'm a writer and I've just got a degree and I'm cleaning offices. If I was in the Eastern Bloc, I would be paid to be a writer or something, you know. I mean, because all those people that came over, Dostoevsky and not Dostoevsky, but Solzhenitsyn. You know, ask him what he was doing before. He was writing. He just couldn't write what.
Yeah. Well, it was a big problem, but yeah.
No, but he was earning a living as a writer.
Yeah.
You know, how many musicians and writers can say, you know, I've got regular gig here, you know, and I'm not saying one is any better than the other, it's a different set of problems. So Ilona, for instance, well, they're all part of a new forum, which was a sort of left-wing socialist, not opposition to the communist regime, and they as soon as she was touring all over as part of the choir, as soon as her political views became known, they didn't stop her touring, but she couldn't tour in the West, so she could tour anywhere in the East. And it was like that, and the musicians that came over, fantastic musicians came over, because they had all had to, they all had to be considered musician, had to reach a certain level of musicianship, so they could all play incredibly well. So these sort of rock and baroque things came over, and anyway, so we learnt about East Germany, and when the wall came down, we thought it'd be nice to tour. So it was just the jazzers came with me. Well, it was only one of the regular jazzers, which was Andy, and he brought Simon and
Julian Siegel.
Siegel, who was a sax player that happened to play double bass, and I was working with African American poet Kevin McCurry, and so we all piled in my VW bus, didn't we?
We did.
And shot across. It was wonderful. This was because I'd toured Europe before with bands, and it was always an exciting whether you were going to get through the border, whether your carny was correct, or you hadn't had your carny signed at the last border, so you didn't want them to stop you. And we went through 5 borders without being stopped, because it was just the beginning of the freedom of movement right through, and that was just like having a huge weight taken off.
Yeah, it was extraordinary, wasn't it?
It was, thank you, Brexiteers.
No, don't
That's
get me.
no, we're not going to go down that rabbit
not.
hole. We're definitely not going to go down that rabbit hole. But I hate you. That's-
Well,
anyway, we got to. I mean, we did this extraordinary tour, didn't we?
Yeah, and a few things stand out for me, including one connected with my interest in theology and religion. But I suppose the major one was getting to play at that place called Tacheles, which was in East Germany. This incredible arts, music, commune. The whole bunch of people have taken over this huge building in the east, and if you do a little bit of Google searching, I think it's spelled Takeles, Tacheles. It's now very, very famous as one of those iconic places to play, and we were lucky to play. It's not quite the Cavern Club, but it's got a really extraordinary vibe, and we had a couple of nights there playing this mixture of poetry, funk, freeform, and a few Stockhausen-inspired modern classical pieces, and everybody loved it.
East Germany, we should, well, Germany in general, we should have just done stuff there. Should have done more, because they got it, didn't they? They would come over.
Right.
I remember there was one bit you'd left by this point to go to Paris, but there was one point where we were in the club, and Julian and Simon were playing. We're just on this huge long improvisation. Yeah, their food arrived, so they'd take turns to play while one ate the food, and so forth, and they'd change jackets, and it turned into a whole musical clowning session. And when they'd finished, it was like, "Good night, folks," and the audience had collected this whole basket of money, saying, "There is more money, you must keep playing." I just can't imagine that happening here.
No, it was. Yeah,
it was extraordinary.
So that's a real memory, and the other gigs were interesting musically as well. And so the second,
that was also frightening, wasn't it?
well, that's the second one I'm going to come to, yeah, which was when we were in Leipzig, which I think was the last gig I did before I had to leave to go to Paris. We were booked into this club. We just turn up and we go downstairs. It was a downstairs basement club, and we set up. And there's a bit of a vibe going on. We're not entirely sure what it is, but it becomes apparent pretty quickly that the gig's going to get cancelled, because there had been a left. We were, not surprisingly, we were playing in left of centre, leftist type clubs, and there had been an attack on a new printing press from the right. I mean, we're talking proper neo-fascist printing press, which had sprung up after the wall came down round the corner from the club. And the people who were connected with that press had decided that the revenge was going to be on this night, and it was going to be the club we were playing.
Yeah, I mean, the printing press was broken up, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
It was sort of like the East German equivalent of Rupert Murdoch, but he made Rupert Murdoch look liberal.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we were all hauled out onto the street, and it became quite clear that we weren't going to play. And so we're packing up, we're getting ready to go, and you can smell petrol. So there's round the corner, there's Molotov cocktails, we assume, being prepared. And John says something, I recall it something like, "I was in Paris in 1968 and I missed it all. I'm not going to miss this."
I recall it as, "I've eaten your food, I'm not going to run."
So there you go. So this is the braver man than us. We decided, well, we weren't going to stay. We didn't have any German. We wouldn't know what to do. So I think I was deputised to drive the van back to Halle, and left you there not knowing whether we were going to see John.
Well, Kevin stayed with me. And
Kevin stayed, that's right.
Yeah, and so I mean, the relevant bit was Julian was Jewish, and his
right.
dad had escaped, and his dad said, "Don't go to Leipzig. It's where it all started." and
Yes, yes.
and I'd never seen. And it was like 50 years had disappeared. I Fear on Julian's bass was incredible. I just threw the keys and said go.
Yes.
And we went and did a reading on a cafe at the other side of
That's
town,
right.
and we went back a few days later, didn't we?
I don't think I did because I had gone.
Oh yes.
So I'd gone. Yeah, I mean, not run away completely. So that was fascinating to see, fascinating and horrific to see how the East German communist regime, whatever you want to call it, government, had managed to sit on those old neo-Nazi tendencies and kept them down, but once that hand had been lifted, it was there again immediately.
Yeah, I mean, the Cottbus, I don't know whether you came to Cottbus with us, where we stayed in. There was sort of guest worker.
Oh
hotels.
yes, no, I was. I
Yeah,
was there for that
and I it was one night where there were 2 nights where I didn't have to drive, so I stayed to get drunk, and you left me there, and it was like walking back, and it was like being. There's a story in Dylan Thomas. No, it might be James Joyce's Dubliners, or the equivalent. Or Thomas wrote a sort of Welsh equivalent, and I can't remember it. But it's short stories, full of short stories, and one of them is someone who goes out to get a packet of cigarettes, and they can't come back. They can't find the flat they've come from because everything looks the same. Yeah. And it was a bit. Cottbus was a bit like that, and so. But I managed to drunkenly find my way back, and I remember people were shouting at us, and I always think when people shout they're saying hello, but Kevin, who had experience of these things, recognises the N-word in any language.
Yeah.
And but 2 weeks later, it was on the news. The very building we were staying in had been set on fire by the extreme right.
So that it was a pivotal moment for me. Actually, we won't go back to it, but another pivotal moment for me as someone from the south of England is also connected with the Arts Centre, because during the miners' strike, often people forget that the miners' strike really came home and was massively present in Colchester, or more Wivenhoe, because that was the port where Thatcher was trying to break the miners' strike by bringing in foreign coal. And so I did a lot of benefits with the same musicians, miners' benefits with the same musicians. I was working with John. And that was a political awakening, seeing what could happen in terms of violence and the violence of the state. That was in Britain. That was a big deal in my life. And then seeing this other manifestation of violence being returned to the street in East Germany, and that was a big life-changing event for me. The other thing, John was very kind, and the other guys in the band were very kind. Back to the theology thing, and I haven't forgotten. We're going to come back to your question, but on this tour, we were travelling from one gig to another and got reasonably near. It was still quite a long way away from Wittenberg, which was where Martin Luther began the Reformation. At least it began according to the, of course, the great. It's not quite a mythical story, but it's the compressed story. It starts there with Martin Luther nailing the 95 Thesis to the Schlosskirche, the big church there. And John and the other guys in the band were persuaded, with not too much difficulty, to stop en route at Wittenberg, and they threw me out onto the street while they sat there and had a bit of a kip and ate something. And my task was to run up and down Wittenberg streets for half an hour. That's all we had. So thank you, John. You got me to a very, very important place.
Yeah. So and then halfway through that tour, we had to put you on a train, and George bought your ticket.
Oh yeah, that's a good story, isn't it? George is, because it's still East Germany at that time, so none of the structures have formally dissolved.
But
All
they were coming apart every night, you know,
Yeah.
because we were due to play somewhere, and that would be closed during the day. We were, and you know, because I remember the jazzers waking me up about 3 o'clock in the morning, saying, "Explain the money to us again, John," and I'd say it's all going to work because I'm a perpetual optimist. It did, in fact.
You did.
But there was no, but you couldn't actually see a path through which it would.
No. We never saw a path in front of us. We managed to follow one, but we never saw it. So George, I had no money. Well, I had some money, but you've just heard money wasn't flowing out of anybody's pockets at that point. So George bought me a ticket at the station in Leipzig, but used his Communist Party card, which meant he got a reduction. I didn't know this. He just gives me the ticket, and he puts me on the train. It's going through to Frankfurt am Main, where I changed and then went to Paris. I had another tour with another band that started in Paris. That's why I was going. So I get on the train, and I've got the window open, and George says, one thing, don't speak. I said, what do you mean don't speak? He said, well, I've bought your ticket on this party card, and if they find out you're not German, they'll throw you off the train. And the train pulls out. And that's it. I'm on my own. I've got no money. I've got my bass, I've got my amp, I've got my bag, and I've got this ticket. And so I thought, what am I going to do? I have a few words of German, but I'm not going to get away with this. So I decided the best strategy was to find a seat on my own. It wasn't particularly full train. And I had to pretend to be asleep all the time for the however many hours this journey took. So when the guard came round asking for tickets, I could appear to wake up and mumble, and simply give my ticket, and the guy would take it, and I could do this sleepy noise stuff, and amazingly it worked. The guard didn't ask me a question, and I managed to make it to Frankfurt am Main and off for the rest of the tour. But that was a pretty nerve-wracking journey. The images of being either arrested or abandoned in the middle of the East German countryside.
Yes.
So I can finish, if it's okay.
Yeah, it's your session.
Well, it's our session. There's
no hierarchy here.
There's no hierarchy here. So I did my tour in France. Actually, the tour was a bit around France. Then we'd had a bit in England. This was with a band called the New Notes Quartet with Peter Oxley, a very, very fine violin bow maker and guitarist, English guitarist, but he was based in Paris. So we did a bit in France. We did some English dates and then had to come back to France for the last few. And it was on the ferry ride back from France, round about Christmas Eve. I can't remember if it was just before or just after Christmas. I'm on the ferry, and I've been thinking about, well, do I really want to go back into the Church of England and pursue this interest in theology and philosophy that way? And it just occurred to me I couldn't do it. I'm too much of a liberal to fall back into the conventional religion of my birth and the English, I do mean English rather than British, of course, Church of England, English nation. And I thought, no, I can't do it. So I went up on deck and I had this big sheet of forms that I'd filled in, and my job was to submit them afterwards. And I tore them all up into small pieces and threw them over the edge of the boat, shouting the word biodegradable. And that was the end of that journey. And it was when I got back to the UK that I eventually found my way to the Ipswich Unitarian Church, because you knew Cliff, the minister there, an extraordinary man. I also owe him a great deal. And became involved in that liberal religious movement. But again, that was a connection that you sort of flagged me up to. I knew about the Unitarians because of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and blah, 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 blah.
In fact, you took me to a lecture on Ralph Waldo Emerson at the Unitarian Church.
Oh, did I?
In Ipswich.
Good Lord.
There was an American preacher over that was and he was
Oh,
doing
yes,
a whole
that's
thing
right.
on Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Yeah.
who wasn't my favourite transcendentalist because of one line in his writings.
Oh, I don't know this story. I don't know this story.
Well, because I my degree's in
I know.
American Studies, so I kind of, the transcendentalists interested me, and but there was one line where he talks about bad news like a fall in rents, because he was a landlord.
Ah, yeah, right.
And as I have been a tenant for most of my life, a short period of my life where I wasn't, and I thought, fall in rents, that's good news. That's not bad news. So I kind of, but then I you know, he did he wrote a lot of good stuff as well.
He did, yeah. We're all historically conditioned in good and bad ways, and yeah, I'm with you. I don't know that quote, but I would agree with you. Yeah, that would grate with me. Still does. Yeah, but
But he did let sorrow keep at the bottom of his by his pond.
that's right, and which of course Thoreau wrote a wonderful book, Walden Pond. Although it's what should we call it? It's very much a sort of poetic form of independence, because he was hugely supported by Emerson and living on Emerson's land. But anyway, that's another subject.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, you know, George Orwell, going back to his mother, between George, it's a sort of literary thing, isn't it? What he wrote down now in London and Paris, he ran back to his mum in between times. You know, Kerouac writes about, you know, that we're all, you know, relying on someone's kitchen.
And I would like to share another story, because I know you say it's my interview, but really it's also about yours. It's about your life, and you can show us your book in a minute. This autobiographical tale, which so many of us are intertwined in John's extraordinary unsound proposition. No, a very sound proposition, which is so John, you've heard John gave me this first job, and then it's through John that I had these first really important musical encounters. Indeed had a direct connection with the Ipswich Unitarian Church, which then led me into the Unitarian ministry much later. And I went to Oxford to study theology later, whilst training for the ministry. But there's another story which I think is important to tell. We had been playing at some literary festival out in a field in Norfolk, or maybe North Suffolk. And we came back very late, and I suggested, it was nearly dawn, I don't know why we were so late, but I said to you, had you ever been to Little Gidding, which is a place in Huntingdonshire now, and it was the site of a commune, an Anglican commune in the 17th century. A man called Nicholas Ferrar, and funnily enough, I now know the person who refounded that community in the 70s and 80s, and good friends with his son. So that's a later story, and so it had refounded as a community. It's a very beautiful place, but it's most famous in the literary world because it was the title of one of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, called Little Gidding. And so I said, had you ever been? You said no. So I said, oh, we got to go. And the sun was about to rise. So we pull into Little Gidding. Again, if you don't know it, take a look maybe on Google Earth or something, because the drive there is very beautiful, very rural. And we pull up, park the van, lean on a 5-bar gate, looking out, sun rising over Little Gidding Church. And I said to John, in a reflective moment, oh, I really wish I'd had the opportunity to study at Black Mountain College, which you'd introduced me to. This was a liberal arts venture school in the Black Mountains, Colorado. Yeah, it's Colorado, isn't it? Where people studied music and the arts and poetry and crafts all together. John Cage was there, Stefan Wolper, the German composer, Albers, the wonderful artist. Buckminster Fuller's another one. And
Well, the geodesic dome,
the geodesic
which was built at Black Mountain College, it became very significant in the fairs in East Anglia.
Exactly.
There were Gilbert in them, yeah.
So all this, and they had this marvellous school, and I was very taken with this free way of education, free, liberative kind of educative system. So I was standing at this gate saying, oh, I really wish that I'd had this opportunity to sort of have this education of hanging out with poets and artists and jazz musicians, this, that and the other. I was waffling on like this. And John stopped me and he looked at me and he said, and what do you think I've been giving you for the last 3 years? And I went, oh my God, of course, yeah. And that was another one of those moments. So that really was my first university course before I went back to study theology formally in my mid-30s, 33 at Oxford. I always consider that my second degree because the first degree was this, it's almost like a Black Mountain College extension course that John had accidentally set up.
Well, and we did take you close to the edge of life.
Yeah,
I mean, on the East German tour, for instance, where I picked up the two hitchhikers, much to everyone's disgust.
That's right.
We already had a van with, this is a Volkswagen bus, and there was, it didn't matter to me because I was up the front, but there was, so the two people up front, but in the back were 3 musicians already, 2 double basses, because of Andy leaving and Simon taking up double bass, the audio equipment, several amplifiers and keyboards, and which made it fairly cramped.
It was fairly cramped, and so what we were doing, we were driving along the Autobahn, going to whatever gig it was. I was just looking to see if it's immediately visible, and I don't think it. Oh, it might be. It is. This is coincidence. I'm going to tell you this because we wouldn't have been able to. I wouldn't have been able to do this had I not been sitting right here next to this. So we're in the van, and John, being John, decides to pick up these 2 hitchhikers. No, 1 hitchhiker. Was it?
No,
one?
2.
It was 2. Yeah.
2 and their luggage.
2 and their luggage. So he stops, and we pick up these 2 hitchhikers. They don't have much English. They have some English. And they get in the van on the other side so from where most of the guys were. They were on the other side. And I was in the front on the passenger seat with John driving. John was tired. We were all tired. And we come to the turning and John realises it somewhat late in the day and decides to take it. So we're pulling around the corner, but at too high a speed, and the whole van goes up on 2 wheels. And looking back on it, we realised that if we hadn't picked up the 2 hitchhikers who were sitting on the opposite side, we'd have just gone over, and that would have been the end of, well, that would have been a very serious accident. So, and that was one of those moments, well, there but for the grace of God or nature or whatever you want to call it, whatever the divine and the sacred name you want to use. I think both of us realised we were very, very lucky to survive.
Most of them were asleep in the back and the faintest idea what was happening.
No, it's just us, I think. But the reason, what I've got here, which I'll show you in a second, is my interest in other religious traditions and cultures. At the time, I was trying to learn Chinese, or at least Chinese characters, which has been quite useful because one of my interests in the last 10 years has been Japanese philosophy and theology, which uses a lot of Chinese characters. So that's been very handy having this. I was learning it, and it turned out this young German lad, who'd saved our life even though he didn't know it, also knew some Chinese, and we were just sharing stories about, you know, what we were up to, who and what various characters mean. And he pulled out of his pocket, see if I can find the actual address that it goes. So he pulled out of his pocket a here we go, this is the thing. He pulled a beer mat. He'd obviously been to Osnabrück, so I'll show you first. And we were talking about Wu Wei,
Yeah.
which is this kind of Chinese concept of push pull. It Alan Watts was big on it, and he wrote it. He wrote it on the beer mat and gave it to me. So there you can see the characters he wrote. So this was given to me by that chap who saved our lives,
accidentally.
Wu Wei, and I ended up writing a piece about it. There you go. It's this was 1998, so this was a few years later. But I wrote it called Wu Wei and the Beer Mat. So yeah, we owe those two lads.
Oh yeah, you got a pamphlet and your life.
So,
yeah. So yeah, but I think. I think that's the only time I nearly killed you, which was not bad considering how many miles we did.
Yeah, we did a lot of miles, often very knackered.
So
yeah.
So then, yeah, I mean, and so then we've sort of bumped into each other in the last few years occasionally, but I mean, yeah, and we swapped stories.
We do.
And amongst the things you did was after you before you had this as a regular gig, and after we'd finished was you were bass man for Cockney Rebel.
Yes, Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel. That's right.
And but you chucked that in.
Well, that's
I
right.
love that story.
Yeah. Well, did I chuck it in, or was I chucked out? The story John's referring to is fairly straightforward. I mean, it happens to all professional musicians one way or another. As John's already intimated, trying to make a living as a professional musician in the UK, as a performing musician, is phenomenally difficult.
Well, you've recently found proof of this.
Well, I mean, it's
a downhill. Musicians practice deflation in a big way.
Yeah, I think you're talking about a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, who was a drummer, actually with the very first version of the Nice. Ian Haig. He died about 10 years ago, and I was his executor, so I had to sort out all his paperwork. So I found his invoices for playing at Centre Parks at the same time I was playing with another band. This is a sort of holiday park that used to have lots of live bands.
Yeah, and storyteller. I did 2 years. I did a storytelling residency there.
Oh, I didn't know that. I hadn't clocked that. Yeah, that was an interesting place. But what was fascinating was looking at his invoices for when I was playing there, which would be in the early 90s. I was getting paid more at face value than I was getting gigs today in the 1990s. And so I carried on playing professionally, I don't know, until about 2019. So yeah, anyway, performing musicians, it's really hard. So we all have to teach and take on teaching jobs. And I had an interesting teaching job at a place called Stoke College, which also supported kids with Asperger's and autism. So it was a rewarding teaching job there. And also I taught at Hoseley Bay, the Young Offenders Institution, the prison where John also was. Maybe we'll talk a bit about that in a second.
That, yeah.
So teaching, in order just to live, pay rent, all that kind of stuff, my teaching gigs were really important. In fact, in many ways, they were more important financial-wise than live gigging. So I'm in Steve Harley's band. I've made a record with him. It was called Poetic Justice. It's still out there. And we were planning to do a European tour. Steve was, so I was going to be in the band, the touring band. And Steve, I mean, I get it. He's put this band together. We know all the material, and he keeps phoning me up and saying, "Well, the start date's this, and it's going to finish here," and it's moving around all over the place. Trying to organise tours is a complete nightmare. But it carried on so long that I needed to take a definite decision about whether I was doing the tour and needed to find someone to cover my teaching, or whether I was going to say, I'm not doing the tour, I'm going to do the teaching. And it was so vague. I phoned Steve up to tell him this, and Steve said to me, I can't believe you're turning down the opportunity of this much money. To which I replied, well, I'm not interested in the opportunity of this much money. I'm interested in this much money. You know, when am I going to start? When's it going to finish? And so he takes that on, and still nothing happens. So there's a second phone call where we go through the same thing again. He repeats, I can't believe you're turning down the opportunity of this much money. But then adds the wonderful line describing my career. I can't believe you're turning down the opportunity of this much money for dribs and drabs and filth. So, anon. And he put the phone down, and that was it. I was out of the band. And I get, like I say, I get it. He was very angry. He had to find another bass player and rehearse them up and all that. But I've really enjoyed that description of my musical career as basically being dribs and drabs and filth. So,
well, part of the dribs and drabs was Hoseley Bay, and which was a young offenders place, and I think I had we did as part of, I started a cultural studies. I wasn't allowed to call it black studies, and part of that was music, and so and I a sort of jazz musician, and Trevor Jones, who was who again played with he was reggae and reggae and funk, and there was one bit down when we both did it, and the young offenders bit, and when the bottom end was an open prison, was Cat D.
That's right.
Cat D, and I remember there was only Trevor as a black tutor, and and he had his green card and everything to say that he was teaching there, and they tried to bang him up at the end of the night because and that was for I think things have changed, but that's a little bit towards majorly in that thing, because I know everyone does the training and stuff, but it was an indication of how things were in the late 80s in the justice system.
That's right. We lost all our jobs in that department with Michael Howard's prison works thing, because of course he decided that real education was only that which led to a particular kind of job, which he decided was the right kind of jobs, and music, art, poetry, film, all those things of course wasn't real. And so slowly our teaching was just chopped off and eventually removed. So I lost that bit of drib and drab.
Yeah. So you probably do better staying with Steve.
But I also, because it was such a fascinating place. Just one thing about how odd Hoseley Bay was. It was a colony originally for training people who were learning how to farm in places like Australia and New Zealand,
which is why it was called Hoseley Bay Colony.
But one of the things that still happens there, even to today, and we're talking in 2024, but we're talking about the early 90s, when I was teaching there, again thanks to John got me that gig, was my classroom overlooked one of the fields. And they still use, it's part of the rehabilitation scheme there, they still use Suffolk Punch's heavy horses to plough.
But it's now independent, so Suffolk, the Hoseley Bay Colony doesn't own them anymore.
They don't.
To
Okay.
the Suffolk Punch Trust.
Oh, right.
But they're still the same. They're from those same animals that went there.
So I'd look out my classroom. I'd be teaching these young kids, locked up young kids, how to play chords and play solos and write songs and all that kind of stuff. And I'd look out the window, and there'd be a horse pulling a plough outside my classroom. It's an extraordinary place.
Brendan Baird was banged up there. It's the inspiration for Borstal Boy.
Ah, okay, I didn't know that. Right.
Yeah, so there's we're pretty well, I think we've sort of covered it really.
Yeah, that's right. And we're on the hour mark.
We're on the hour mark.
But you got to flog your book a bit.
Oh yeah, well, because this is the tail end of the project, which I've just thrown more. Pootling Through is available. Get hold of me, Facebook me, or send me a message. I'll tell you how to get it. PayPal me, John Rowe Poet, and send me 15 quid, and you can have a copy.
We've already we didn't rehearse this, but John's like this. He said, "Oh yeah, you got to do this." He's going to sign the book. Yes, John would have given me this book because that's what he would have done. Of course he would. But we've just been talking about how it's impossible to make any money about this. So I said to him, I know you're going to give me the book. Thank you. That's really kind. But I'm going to pay you for it. And then John said, no, you're not going to pay me for it. He's going to give me the book, and I'm going to give him a gift of 15 quid. That's it. So we can do it on film.
Okay, so we're going to do this. I've just signed it to him. You can't see it.
No, you can't see it.
In fact, I'm going to complete the signature now.
Yeah, complete the signature.
This will be worth absolutely nothing in a few years' time.
So this is my free gift. This is my free copy. And John, thank you. This is my free gift to you.
So, thank you. £15, marvellous. That's a little bit more. And with that, I think it's marvellous.
Okay,
fantastic.
Excellent.
So if we can get this under 2 gigabytes, we can send it on free on.
It is.
We transport.
Okay, guys and gals. See you later. Yeah. Bye.